get started with our second morning plenary. This plenary is in honor of and to celebrate From Our Hearts to Yours, New Narratives as Contemporary Practice, beautifully edited by Halpern and Robin Tremblay-McGaw. This anthology of criticism was another occasion for this conference. It's an amazing book. It's got a beautiful bibliography, tons of wonderful essays. It's available for sale down the hall, and many of the contributors are here with us. So in addition to Robin, please welcome David Buuck, Robbie Dewhurst, Thom Donovan, Kaplan Harris, Trisha Lowe, Ted Rees, Camille Roy, Kathy Lou Schultz, and Eric Sneathen. And now Robin.
Do you want to stand with me? Can't bear to be alone. Wow, this is an amazing occasion, and Robin and I are both full of gratitude. So, on behalf of the both of us, we just want to express heartfelt thanks to the organizers of this event, Daniel and Eric. Really. This was like a rumor a year ago at this time, right? It's a pretty amazing manifestation of that. And we need to express infinite gratitude to Michael Cross and Thom Donovan, the publishers at On Contemporary Practice, for believing in this thing.
Not to mention the tremendous amount of labor that went into this project. So I guess I'm going to just begin by telling you how this is going to work. So our process is that Rob and I are going to read a bit from the intro, and then each of the contributors will have a couple of minutes to read a selection from their contribution, and then all of the contributors submitted or framed questions about the book as a whole, and then we took those questions and synthesized them. So we have 6 or so questions that we're going to entertain up here, and we hope that you will also want to engage in this conversation with us.
Yeah, and just on that note, I know sometimes it's a little awkward, but we really do want to encourage everyone and anyone to jump in, shout out a question. We'll do our best to be as attentive to the room in the interest of facilitating a strong and inclusive conversation. Okay, so as Robin said, we're just going to kind of jump through our intro that we wrote collaboratively, and just read some portions of it to give you some framing for the book, and we hope for the discussion to follow. So we called the intro A Generosity of Response, New Narrative as Contemporary Practice, and that phrase actually came to us from a little note that Bruce Boone had written by hand at the top of a type draft, one of actually several type drafts of a talk that he gave at New Langton called Negativity in 1985. Robin and I stumbled upon the draft at the poetry collection at University of Buffalo last year.
I think Kathy was there as well.
And the phrase, actually, so I'll read you the epigraph from which the phrase in the title of our intro derives. Bruce writes, something about autobiography equals injection of element of risk in your writing. And risk is a generosity of response to what's beyond you as a writer and person. We were sort of astonished by that. It never made its way into any text. It's just like a little handwritten note, but pretty beautiful and telling. So.
What is new narrative? Our book aims to explore this literary movement as an open set of related works as well as an array of cultural practices and persistent questions concerning writing and risk, ethics and politics, self and story. One of the several propositions informing this collection engages new narratives' contemporariness and historicity. Not only is it a literary phenomenon located in the past, but an ongoing conversation with a capacious reach. As for its origin story, new narrative emerged during the late 1970s and 80s with a group of San Francisco Bay Area writers, Steve Abbott, Robert Gluck, Bruce Boone, who asserted the critical and imaginative values of identity and storytelling for a formally innovative and activist writing. This was at a time when self and story were arguably considered retrograde by the avant-garde of the US writing scene, within which new narrative located itself. According to Abbott, who first identified new narrative in the second issue of the lo-fi literary zine called Soup, new narrative is language conscious, but arises out of specific social and political concerns of specific communities. Together, Abbott, Gluck, and Boone theorized their practice as they elaborated a range of tactics negotiating writerly pleasure, self-fashioning, social engagement, and reflexive accountability. Put another way, new narrative aimed to straddle the distance between language poetry, with its emphasis on the materiality of signification, and movement writing, with its emphasis on the centrality of identity, while maintaining close ties to both in its emphasis on construction and expression, artifice and selfhood. At the same time, new narrative was close to queer performance art as it mobilized an impure aesthetic, incorporating high and low culture, probing the collective fictions of the person and personality, while also foregrounding popular culture as a scene of social practice and politics.
While recognizing the importance of this historical framing, we wanted to organize an engagement with new narrative as a project still under construction, an engagement that honors its history while remaining faithful to the proliferation of contemporary interest in new narrative in both the Bay Area and beyond, without being overdetermined by our preconceptions. With this in mind, we circulated a query in November 2012, that seems like forever ago, right? Seeking essays that would allow writers and readers to make their own meaningful contact with new narrative as a movement still unfolding in the present. As part of our effort to frame this work, we wrote, and this is excerpted from our original call, "We are not interested in offering an authoritative canon of new narrative work, nor are we interested in consolidating an official version of new narrative's history. Rather, we want to use this as an opportunity to foreground new narrative as a movement that is still coming into focus, a more or less unstable object that doesn't want to be fixed, codified, or hardened into a limited and limiting set of names and works. One of our motivating questions is, why new narrative now? Or what are the stakes of new narrative for our contemporary moment? In other words, while we remain committed to a set of past works that have been identified as new narrative, we are equally committed to maintaining new narrative as a dynamic and ongoing project, one with consequences for our present writing."
For those of you who may be new to this story, the set of past works to which we remain committed as cornerstone new narrative texts might include Bruce Boone's Century of Clouds and My Walk with Bob, Robert Gluck's Elements and Jack the Modernist, Dodie Bellamy's The Letters of Mina Harker and Feminine Hijinks, Kevin Killian's Shy and Bedrooms Have Windows, and Camille Roy's Rosy Medallions and Swarm. We want to stress the subjunctive mood of our proposition here by underscoring might, because this list might have been composed otherwise.
For example, Rob immediately thinks of Aaron Shurin's little chapbook entitled Negativity, as well as Carla Harriman's collection There Never Was a Rose Without a Thorn, and Kathy Acker's novel My Life, My Death by Pier Paolo Pasolini.
while Robin thinks of Eileen Miles' Chelsea Girls, Pamela Lou's Pamela, and Mike Amnason's Liar. Given our commitment to the expansive hospitality of this orbit, we've tried to maintain the porousness and elasticity of every list so that as wide a range of writers and readers as possible can enter as they wish. And so, rather than a protocol of canonical texts and frozen assumptions, we want to present New Narrative as a dynamic, commodious, and open project, one that is accessible as a contemporary practice for anyone who might feel some kinship with it. At the same time, our own orientation as writers who were similarly seeking affinities and kinships within the Bay Area's writing ecology in the late 80s and early 90s no doubt delimits our frame of reference.
And we go on to talk about the importance of very hospitable Bay Area house workshops that Rob and I both participated in various ways during the 90s. While recognizing the, I think I read that already. Yes, as the emergence of New Narrative in the late 1970s itself attests, every project is both enabled and limited by its social histories and geographic locations, and this book is no doubt similarly enabled and constrained. That said, the essays included here, rather than tread familiar ground, consistently disabuse and complicate our assumptions about what New Narrative is or might be, while expanding and ramifying that horizon. Roomy in the collective vision that they manifest, these 24 contributions variously address, both directly and indirectly, the AIDS crisis, the politics of race, the structural impacts of neoliberalism on urban space, and the movement across queer, straight, and transgender subject positions. Other topics of investigation include the category of queer art, the importance of feeling, the fiction of personality, the necessity of risk, the function of pedagogy, the strategy of appropriation, as well as scandal and gossip, as these topics have been important to New Narrative and its expanded sphere of influence.
As Dodie Bellamy and Kevin Killian's recently edited anthology, Writers Who Love Too Much, New Narrative Writing 1977 to 1997 suggests, New Narrative may very well have been a centrifugal movement, always traveling idiosyncratically away from its more familiar point of departure in late 1970s San Francisco along very diverse trajectories, acting, as Gertrude Stein so aptly put it, so that there is no use in a center. Whereas Writers Who Love Too Much situates New Narrative's adventure across the 80s while looking toward the first celebratory Outright Conference, an event that showcased many of the innovative queer literary tendencies one can associate with New Narrative, we found ourselves looking back toward another event, the Left-Right Conference held in San Francisco in 1981, before the ravages of the 1980s altered the social landscape irreparably. In its effort to enhance a set of common aims across multiple communities of left-oriented writers, Left-Right addressed structural injustice by bridging divides across race, gender, sexuality, labor, and class in the interest of a more unified leftist front among writers. Abbott, Boone, and Gluck all participated in the steering committee, together with Denise Kasten and John Mueller. The conference goals were consonant with those of the Gay Liberation Front, which integrated sexual, gender, and class politics. It seems to us now that these two analogously named conferences, Left-Right and Outright, bookend New Narrative's first decade of intense productivity, with the AIDS crisis as one of its primary pivot points. Not coincidentally, Steve Abbott was involved in convening both these conferences.
Today, we continue to look to left-right as a way of understanding the promises and failures of the sort of community building that has always been central to New Narrative. Decades later, contemporary writing communities continue to struggle with similar questions and contradictions around unity and difference, privilege and oppression, solidarity and marginalization. In this light, the Left-Right Conference remains significant as an example of an organized response with all its successes and failures. While the transcript of the conference proceedings has been available in various archives and libraries for some time, we are making this text accessible as one of several online appendices to our book, together with a rich reservoir of documents to this event. And this is our moment to point to a set of archival, really what we're hoping will constitute a reservoir of archival documents, interviews, and other ancillary materials that we've imagined as an accompaniment to the reading of the book. And that material will be housed on the On Contemporary Practice website. And I'm just going to ask Thom Donovan, who's organizing that platform right now, maybe just to say something about it and how it can be located and accessed.
It's very simple. If you go to On Contemporary Practice's website, there's a link to From Our Hearts to Yours, and if you link there and scroll below, you'll eventually find those archival materials.
Yeah. And maybe we'll just briefly list what they are, and you'll help me remember. So we have a rather extensive index of the entire book, and the book includes a proper name and place index, but we've also indexed ourselves. An interminable effort. I don't know, how many pages is it now, Michael?
Right now I think it's 25 pages.
Yeah, it's 25 pages.
And that's just the index that's online. There's also the index.
Yeah, so a remarkably rich subject and keyword and concept index that we considered reading a bit from as a poem, because it really does read as a poem. Is, we hope, quite useful. So there's the index. There are 3 interviews. Jocelyn Seidenberg has interviewed Bruce Boone. Miranda Mellis, who sadly can't be here with us today because canceled flight from Seattle, interviews Kevin Killian, and Robbie Dewhurst has interviewed Dodie Bellamy. So those 3 interviews, which were solicited for the book, are on the website together with, yes, and we are including, this is a call out to our friend and remarkable scholar Earl Jackson, whose work on new narrative in his 1998, I believe it's 1995, that's even more awesome, Strategies of Deviance, really is the first scholarly look at new narrative, naming it, situating it, and exploring critically the work of Robert Buuck, Kevin Killian, Dennis Cooper, and I think Dodie's in there as well.
And Delaney, Samuel Delaney.
Yeah, tremendous amount of material on Samuel Delaney in that book. And we're going to include a PDF of Earl's chapter on scandalous narratives, which we think of as sort of a point of departure for critical and scholarly work on the narrative on the site as well. Documents pertaining to the Left-Right Conference, a lot of correspondence between Bruce Boone and Steve Abbott. Also correspondence with the city about the organization and where funding was coming from, proposals which really do inform the conference at its inception and give us a good sense of what its motivations and intentions were, as well as a PDF of the proceedings of the entire conference will be there as well. Am I missing anything?
No.
Sue.
Oh, yes.
Sue, yes. We'll have a scanned PDF of the entirety of Soup number 2, which was the new narrative issue, where new narrative gets named by Steve Abbott, the editor. Wow. Okay, so 35 years after Left, Right, the Poetics Next 25 Years conference convened in April 2016 to celebrate 25 years of the Poetics program at the University of Buffalo. As part of this event, 9 of the participating writers in this volume met around the table, similar to this one, and many of folks here were also there, which gave us an opportunity to really think through the book a year ago now in the interest of helping us prepare this introduction. So we really think of that first meeting as an opportunity to help us to inform the introduction that we're reading to you now.
So while we had initially framed new narrative as a literary movement, we came away from our seminar, thinking about new narrative as a set of practices, reading practices, writing practices, and critical practices that new generations of writers are taking up and remixing in an array of poetics. And so we find ourselves addressing new narrative as an evolving set of practices, practices we hope this collection of essays enables further, allowing for their ongoing elaboration in as yet unexpected ways that depend on you.
By now, we hope it's obvious that the book remains committed to the kind of social, sexual, and literary promiscuity that new narrative has always stood for. And perhaps we need that promiscuity now more than ever, together with new narrative's permission to maintain the body and self as vulnerable and porous, resistant to newly resanctioned forms of fortification and borderization. In a utopian gesture consonant with the clarion call for enabled community life that marks new narrative's inception, our hope is that from our hearts to yours, new narrative as contemporary practice will spur as of yet unimagined conversation and texts, new readers and writers, unanticipated solidarities and camaraderie. And so we conclude this introduction with yet another line from Bruce Boone, this time from Century of Clouds, that continues to mark one horizon of this project. And this is a sentence many of you are probably familiar with. You want what you write to actually cause these things to come to exist. Should we just go again? So everyone takes about 2 minutes to read or talk about work.
This is the first section of my essay. It's called Undergrid, an essay on obscurity. Can
everyone hear Camille?
Can you hear her? Should I stand up?
Yeah. It's going to be hard to use the mic because there's so many. It'll take a lot of time. But.
One day, about a year ago,
Mike.
Okay.
Mike.
Thanks, Eileen.
One day, about a year ago, a book came in the mail. It was called When Ghosts Speak, and it arrived by mistake. No one had ordered it. The author, a devout Catholic, was on relaxed terms with that part of the spirit world which had not transitioned by entering the white light. Her terminology. Her attitude towards ghosts was offhand and extremely assured. I scanned the book for a few moments before tossing it into the recycling bin. It turned out to be preparation for an odd incident which occurred a few days later. I was driving on 8th towards Potrero Hill when suddenly a dead friend was sitting next to me in the car. His familiar presence resonant in the empty space. You might say it made a ghostly noise, although he didn't speak. Just then a rotary phone loudly rang. What to make of this? I reflected on my friend's life, which had been rich in unfortunate experiences. In fact, these were the kinds of experiences which become lurid and deformed by representation. It's as though a voyeuristic appetite gets released in language and then preys upon the subject, my subject. As a consequence, I feel attracted by the manifold protections of silence. But I will give one example, because the image it creates for me is so weirdly Christ-like. While sleeping in Golden Gate Park, my friend was once woken up by rats licking the blood that seeped from scabs on his arms. Such stories burst from him in language that had so much vividness and energy it possessed its own uncanny life. When he died, I had to mourn the death of his language as something distinct from his physical death, a separate loss. Today, I think that the presence of death in life characterizes language. That is the most true part of the story I've just told. Like any native speaker, I handle English with a sense of ease, but over time, its uncanny aspect has become more present. Words are the oldest human objects which enter my daily life. Yesterday I was reading some of the riddles of the Exeter book, and this word shone forth unchanged. Swafu, swife, lahu, swift was on four. Swift. I'm not construing death as an abstract barrier. It's more of a thin curtain drawn over the churning mass of former times, always present, always invisible. As a joke, I once told a student that language was a zombie, acting alive but composed of dead parts. We both found the idea oddly satisfying. What does it mean to be close to a person's language? My friend who died had a way with it, which meant anything could happen, many startling fabrications. Once he was going to Canada to attend a festival for skateboarders. Probably it was one of those extreme sports events. At the border, they pulled him into a room and showed him a printout from an American law enforcement agency that went on for pages and pages. It contained the details of all of his 31 aliases. I'm hesitant to characterize my experience of my friend's ghost as a delusion. This is not because I think that ghosts are real, or at least they are not exactly real. It is this: the obscurity of language makes the real quiver.
It's from Teaching New Narrative. The previous paragraphs were composed in the fall of 2013 when I first attempted to write this essay. It still seems like a good place to start insofar as it provides an account of the sentiments that a course largely based on new narrative writing engendered. It bears repeating that the class was important for me, especially for my development as a teacher, because it opened up my classroom to modes of vulnerability and intimacy that I normally find difficult to establish among students. And it also bears repeating that I believe these modes were activated by the material we were reading together, as well as the approach I took with the students, which was not merely to interpret the material through a method of exegesis, nor to historicize the text or apply theory to it dryly, but instead to tell stories about ourselves in which the meaning and stakes of a set of texts could appear just as the meaning of our lives could appear as informed by various social contexts. As my anecdotal account above also makes apparent, the classroom I was able to establish with my students also felt much more familiar and informal than a typical classroom. While I hesitate to say that the students were more like peers, though a few of them were, there was a desirable parity among us, a parity that all respected despite the challenging nature of some of the material, which another institution or set of students might deem obscene or pornographic. How to talk about sex, queer sex in particular, and non-normative bodies, bodies that don't conform to the norm of white, straight, male, cis, able-bodied, in such a way that it would not become inappropriate and that all could feel included. To what extent was feeling out of one's comfort zone a productive aim that the class achieved, wherein students were able to confront very radical and sometimes incommensurable differences in experiences among themselves. Looming in certain discussions was my own sense that it was necessary to present students with material that in some cases viscerally challenged their sensibility, inasmuch as homophobia and a fear of non-normative bodies are both conditioned by the society that we share. That the students on the whole were able to engage openly about sexual practices and visceral representations of the body, I consider a success of the class. The course was also unique for me for the ways that it challenged my authority. Many of our class activities and discussions were directed by the students, making my involvement in the classroom much more like that of a participant than an authority figure or master over the subject. Of course, my annual visual poetics class at School of Visual Arts always seems to go in this direction, towards the more hands-on and intuitive. But in no class before or since has it made so much sense to elevate storytelling as a means of accessing the course readings, as well as a means of investigating the discursive framework of the classroom itself. These dynamics, I believe, extend from the materials we encountered, specifically the works of new narrative and post-new narrative writers.
My contribution is titled A Superficial Estimation, John Wiener's and New Narrative, and I think I'll just read the first paragraph and then a couple sentences. John Wiener's last visited San Francisco, foggy home of his Hotel Bentley poems, for a reading at the Roxy Theater arranged by Robert Buuck under the aegis of the SFSU Poetry Center in March 1990. The mustachioed eponymous Bob of New Narrative Canon introduced the evening momentously. When I became director of the Poetry Center, I made a wish list of dream readings that I would like the Poetry Center to sponsor, and this reading is really at the top of that list. Luke's brief opening remarks began. Kevin Killian then introduced Wiener's, heralding him to the stage as one of the great poets of our century, and indelibly blurbing Wiener's as behind the state capitol, as a, quote, huge, mysterious necronomicon of angst, revolt, lurid glamour, and lost love. Wiener shuffled to the podium wearing a flannel shirt and thick plastic glasses, his hair disheveled. I have 30 minutes, and I always had a wild, weird voice, he started off. It's Martha Ray's voice. When I was 2 years old, she left it to me in her will. After then dedicating his reading to Ray's sister, Increase Sumner, elected 5th governor of Massachusetts in 1797, Wiener's began to read from an overstuffed folder of mostly unpublished work, reciting through a smokescreen. His voice slipped in and out of a stagey whisper as he voiced his lines quizzically, hesitantly, inscrutably. Viewing the Poetry Center's videotape of this event, shot by Cush and now online at Penn Sound, I'm left with the impression that it's almost as if Wiener's himself is hearing some of this work for the first time. His reading lasted just 24 minutes. An interview with Killian followed from the podium, of a piece with the rest of the evening. Wiener's answered 20 questions about his life and writing with comic circumlocution, leading Killian into a puzzling parlay of pop cultural trivia, nonsense, non sequitur, and innuendo. Killian rolled with this routine with his typical tousled aplomb, although Bruce Boone in the audience that night has told me that he cringed when the crowd laughed at some of Wiener's remarks. This portion of the tape does border on uncomfortable, as it's not always clear if the audience is laughing with or at Wiener's winding replies, some of which on reflection seem to be actual answers. But Wiener's, for his part, appeared to enjoy the charade. I have a prisoner, and his name is you, he ribbed Killian near the end of their exchange. This barb seemed to sum up Wiener's approach to the whole event, his first appearance in San Francisco in at least 15 years. John read in a whisper, Bill Bergson recalled of that night. You couldn't hear him at all. But then the Q&A turned into a kind of really beautiful, exquisite corpse that could be heard perfectly. It was a knockout. The brightest item in the faded footage is Kevin's satin necktie, all ruby red and luminous, but which fails to convey him, like Dorothy, out of Oz. How to describe the relation of John Wiener's and New Narrative? One entry point would seem to be the San Francisco summit, but the videotape has all the unsatisfied atmosphere of a missed connection. Its characters, at best, seem to be talking past each other. I would like in this piece to think about this lost connection between John Wiener's and New Narrative.
I'm Ted. So the essay that's in this beautiful volume kind of deals with my abiding obsession with David Wojnarowicz. And so it begins actually with an epigraph from him. So, I am beginning to believe that one of the last frontiers left for radical gesture is the imagination. In his long note on new narrative, Buuck mentions that he writes in order to take part in the world that ceaselessly makes itself up, to wake up to the world, to recognize the world, to be convinced that the world exists, to take revenge on the world for not existing. Bob's reasons for writing are, in many ways, my reasons, and I feel they provide a rather potent structure for understanding why we craft fictions for ourselves, why the elided and the imagined event are such powerful tools not only in writing our lives, but living our lives. What Wojnarowicz calls the ungoverned imagination can aid in forging new foundations of relations. They can bring comfort, but most of all, they can allow us to take part in the world, whether it exists or not. The unfettered capability of the imaginative gesture is what makes it subversive and thus dangerous. Wojnarowicz's visions of dousing Jesse Helms in gasoline and lighting him on fire, Dodie Bellamy as Mina Harker's statement that the monstrous and formless have as much right as anybody else, Dennis Cooper's incarnation of the nihilistic ennui of youth in Southern California. All of these written gestures are daggers aimed at the jugular of propriety, of concreteness and conformist strictures. They are in the world, but surreptitiously ask the question that Gluck asks in his long note: how can I convey urgent social meanings while opening or subverting the possibilities of meaning itself? The gestures tear at the world, its meanings and codes, and find an effluvium that upends these meanings and codes, thus creating new landscapes and textures of reality. Our willingness to build and write our own realities is commensurate with a willingness to be dissonant with what the world foists upon us, our stories and psyches. As such, what is called new narrative writing is inherently a writing based in defiance. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Kathy Lou Schultz, and my piece is called Gender and Genre in Dodie Bellamy's Academonia. Bellamy both acknowledges and complicates the story of new narrative for us, showing her position as a woman writer among or descended from this group, sometimes for, sometimes against prevailing attitudes and aesthetics. Bellamy does so in part by locating herself in the literary scene in San Francisco in the 1980s. Back in the 80s, when I was a student in Bob Gluck's Monday night workshop at Small Press Traffic, I showed Bob everything I wrote, and he would give me thorough critiques. Bob gave me advice on everything from where to submit my writing, to how to manage my disintegrating first marriage, to what eyeliner to wear, to how to navigate the thorny Bay Area literary scene. Rob Halpern locates these thorny conflicts between new projects and old affiliations in the Bay Area literary scene: language writing, feminist writing, black arts, beat poetry, new American poetics, and others, each asserting a distinct set of aesthetic values and social stakes. How then, in the midst of these communities, does Bellamy become, from the children's song, the cheese who stands alone? The answers include both genre and gender. In Crimes Against Genre, Bellamy explains her recent considerations of how, if it is possible to write outside of genre. What kind of marginality is that? Free-floating outside the social order like David Bowie's Major Tom? Doesn't genre infect everything we write or think? Is genre then a virus that infects our very thoughts? It certainly was at the center of many debates between and among new narrative and language writers. Back in the mid-'80s, Bellamy writes, when I left poetry for prose, it wasn't a gradual transition, but a dramatic gesture. Like all my gestures back then, I would tell people I had abandoned poetry. No more poetry, I declared, and I meant it. Considering the genre issue further, Bellamy reflects back on her own work, The Letters of Mina Harker, 1998. Bellamy remembers Gluck saying this book wasn't so much a novel as a book of lyric poetry. Yeah, sure, Bob, I thought, Bellamy shares. But perhaps he's right. Perhaps new narrative, for some of us at least, was really about poetry. a ruse, a spin doctrine to pull off what was verboten in the San Francisco scene, narrative poetry. Perhaps there is room for understanding new narrative then, not as outside of genre, but instead as a dialectical recombination of poetry and prose. Bellamy's description of one way in which the new narrative language poetry debates might have manifested in the Bay Area in the 80s is much funnier, however. Quote, I think of Bob Perlman's parody of lyric poetry, I look out the window and I'm deep. New narrative at its worst would be, I have sex and I'm smarter than you. Thus, while language writers thought to throw off the tyranny of unified subjectivity represented in the history of lyric, new narrative writers combining theory and bodies and sex also hungered for the possibilities contained within narrative. Perhaps it allows a space in which the body itself and as a text can stand as representation of the community. For gay male writers active in new narrative production, the focus on the gay male body seems perhaps self-evident. For Bellamy, however, insisting on the female body and the experience of inhabiting one provides a challenging counter-narrative for how autobiography is figured in new narrative texts. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Kaplan. I'm going to read the first 3 paragraphs of my essay. It's called Poetry with Feelings. Robert Duncan is on a roll. In the last few years, the University of California published 4 volumes of his poetry and prose. The same press published Lisa Jarno's hefty biography, The Ambassador of Venus. At the same time, North Atlantic Books published an edition of his interviews, and the Great Gallery at NYU organized the exhibition Jess, Robert Duncan, and Their Circle. Now, as expected, critics are writing omnibus reviews that consider Duncan's work in its entirety. This reception is surely the first step in a larger reassessment of Duncan's place in 20th century letters. One recent review, however, will give readers pause. The author is the English poet Peter Riley, who's often associated with the Cambridge School of the British Poetry Revival. The history of the British Poetry Revival is regularly told as a sort of reverse colonization, wherein Edward Dorn, John Wieners, and fellow visitors from the New World helped resuscitate the moribund poetry of the Old World. This version of the story is full of problems, but it still captures a degree of truth about the way the English poets once embraced the Yankee counterculture. The American poets, quote, seem to be the answer to everything, as the older Riley concedes. Looking back, however, he is troubled by what he sees as Duncan's totalizing tendencies. For him, these new books reveal a troubling degree of presumptuousness. Duncan has pretended to see the world from a trans-historical vantage, and Riley finds this audacity appalling. But that's not the part that will give readers so much pause. Rather, it is that Riley rejects any consideration of Duncan's queerness. He says in an endnote to the review, I don't mention in this review that Duncan was a homosexual because I can't think of any reason to. But academic studies of him, especially in the USA, have, of course, raised this as the central issue of his poetry, making all of it a specifically gay issue not fully open to the understanding of the heterosexual mind. I think he would have abhorred this, says Riley. There's at least 2 problems here. One is the idea that taking queerness as an interpretive lens means shattering all other lenses in the process. As Riley, given his rush to judgment, is evidently not very well versed in queer theory, this barely needs a response. Failing to raise Duncan's sexuality because he, quote, can't think of any reason to is a bigger problem. Duncan's writing life was deeply entwined with the history of gay liberation. His landmark essay, The Homosexual in Society, got him blackballed by the poet John Crow Ransom in the 1940s. M.L. Rosenthal once described his poetry as, quote, girly, a point that he takes up in the preface to Caesar's Gate. Duncan was one of the first poets to use the word cock in a poem. Another poem, The Torso, performs an extraordinary revision of the lyric IU around 2 male lovers. He extensively researched the psychopathology of language. The word Freud appears 24 times in the HD book. Duncan's interest in fantasy, Spicers in Martians, and Helen Adams in Werewolves are bright signs that the Berkeley Renaissance was a bit of a campy affair. The review makes no mention of Duncan's longtime lover Jess, no mention of Jarno's biography, which chronicles his domestic life in detail, no mention of San Francisco, no mention of gay liberation, no mention of AIDS. And all are, of course, enormously important for reading Duncan, though Riley mentions none of them. This preamble is one way to introduce the case of new narrative, which long worked against the ideology of universal straightness. As members of the generation that followed Duncan and greatly indebted to him, these writers actively put a halt to the narrow neutralizing on display in Riley's vision of literary history. In the 70s and 80s, they staged an intervention that took place in multiple arenas. They wrote stories of friendship and desire using the vast toolbox of post-structural narrative. They drew on newly translated continental philosophy and political theory to craft a group poetics through statements, manifestos, and essays. They ran their own small presses, magazines, workshops, and study groups. They led grassroots actions within and beyond their own community. Their poetics, moreover, resisted not only the power brokers of the literary marketplace, but also the avant-gardes of straight white masculinity. Their struggle was against the commonplace view, still celebrated by Riley in 2014, that degreed queerness inaudible. Thank you.
Excuse me. My essay is on Renee Gladman's work, specifically looking at her writing about the city and formal strategies thinking about the city. And I'm going to read 3 or 4 paragraphs from the middle that, because I've been thinking in the last 24 hours a lot about my own troubling nostalgias for what we think of the second, those of us who came into new narrative in the 90s, sort of this second generation. Cappy, Robin, Rob, who I also all met in Dodie or Bob's workshops, Pam Liu, Sumi Kaipa, Tisa Bryant, Mary Berger, Taylor Brady. But also as a moment of, we really need to be thinking about city and writings of the city for several avant-gardes through the lens of real estate, as it becomes increasingly difficult for poets to live certain lifestyles in certain cities. Which is not to say that San Francisco is a playground for certain bodies, as we know from, for instance, the first story in Dodie and Kevin's anthology, Bob, Sanchez, and Day, about navigating the city through the lens of being chased by gay bashers. Going nowhere in the city is a form of idleness, but not necessarily one without movement or subjective experience. Non-purposive movement and the passing of time can be fruitful modes of translating the threshold moments between experience of city immersion and its temporality. Rarely, if ever, do we see Gladman's narrators or characters at work or come across some mention of forms of wage labor that presumably undergird the kind of mostly idle and reflective, if also often anxious, lifestyles her characters seem to live. While her characters are certainly not urban flaneurs in the traditional sense, nor are they privy to the privileged masculinist gaze of the man in the street, they do share something of this romantic tradition, where experience of daily life moves through the prisms and contingencies of the city in leisurely reflection. I'm skipping ahead here. At the same time, Gladman's narrators live in and through an era in which such a lifestyle is increasingly no longer tenable. The bohemianism of one's 20s gives way to the economic pressures of living in urban zones wrought by the forces of gentrification and self-replicating hipsterdom. And I'd argue in the case of the Bay Area, massive whitewashing. While Gladman's cities are rarely, if ever, named, unless invented as with Ravika, it is difficult for me not to read her early work in the context of San Francisco's Mission District in the 90s and early 2000s, where Gladman, myself, and several other poets lived during the emergence of her first zine and chapbook publications. The Mission during that time, and here's the, apologize for my nostalgia seeping through. The Mission during that time was a vibrant and dynamic matrix. Oh, it's awful. Thom, why didn't you catch this when you're editing this? Vibrant and dynamic matrix of people and encounters. And whatever, let's just say attractive young poets, let's just throw that in there. That's new narrative. Skip that part. Place of daily contact between diverse groups, interracial, cross-cultural, interclass, intergenerational, where bohemian ethos, if often pseudo and or invisibly well-funded, still reign despite the looming gentrification brought on by the influx of dot-com money. Such contact zones, including the places where money confronts the marginalized via real estate speculation, policing, and architecture as much as the urban planners, provided ripe experiences for contingency and exploration, investigation, and experimentation. At the same time, without ever writing what one might think of as San Francisco stories, Gladman was able to identify the ways in which gentrification can make certain city dwellers, i.e. the non-white and the working class, no longer feel welcome in their rapidly disappearing home zones. Tellingly, however, her meditations on the mission come only after she has left, mediated by memory and a rereading of her writing of that time, a retelling in her novel, Two After That, of her city writing and its limitations. And here's a quote. "Every day I mourn the displacement of the city's people. I saw my favorite streets overcome, apartment buildings having stood 100 years, demolished in a day to erect lofts, holes in the walls, restructured into boutiques, and new money-laden citizens crowding the sidewalks. Years," it's interesting to think about the crowd as suddenly is in the way rather than a place of vibrant encounter. "Years before, it was the bank receipts people left behind at ATM machines, the bold disclosures of wealth that alerted me to what was ahead. Nobody with $300 or less in the bank ever left those slips behind." End quote. Last paragraph. The city people are, of course, not just any people, but the working class families and people of color in the mission, the non-new money laden. I thus read my favorite streets overcome, not simply as nostalgia for or a mourning of certain neighborhood places and architectural styles, local color being whitewashed by real estate logics of gentrification, but a mode of city living that produced specific forms of alternative sociality, where city thinking could push up against overlapping zones of multicultural and non-normative lifestyles. The dot-com new money crowding the sidewalks does not just displace other bodies, but here literally blocks the public arteries of passage, the pathways between Gladman's characters as they try to maintain connection and relation. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Trisha Lowe. In 2012, when this anthology was coming together, I had just graduated college. I'm not pointing this out to humiliate myself or to be an asshole, but I'm just pointing it out because I really appreciate this volume's expansiveness and inclusivity when it comes to contemporary practice. And I was very honored when Robin asked me to write a little bit about Kathy Acker. It's less of an essay than a polemic. It's called Better Off Dead on Waterboarding, New Narrative, and the Flatness of Kathy Acker. And I talk also a little bit about my friend Joey Algazin's work in digital platforms and just thinking about how Acker's work in genre has really influenced him, but also thinking towards newer works like Dennis Cooper's blog and the more contemporary digital stuff coming out. So I'm just going to read a little bit. Joey writes in an essay entitled Everybody's Obituary, "My goal is to push poetry to the limit point of the dead zone, an obsolete zone of pure waste and negativity. Against the utopian embrace of auto-generating textual environments, poetry can claim the decay and obsolescence that undergirds these new distributed platforms. Within these dead zones, there was once affect and subjectivity, but they are now abandoned, rotting forever in cyberspace. For Joey, everybody might already be dead, but I'm laughing because despite everything, I'm somehow still here, I guess. It's not that funny." Joey says that to writers like him and me, Kathy Acker is ha-ha, like breathing. A lot has been made of Kathy Acker's transgressiveness, her sexuality, her obscenities, her performative harshness. Indeed, the rawness of Acker's text has often been easily reduced to the kind of one-size-fits-all doom that Chris Burdon personified. cruelty as uncomplicated as a crushing act of violence. But what's interesting about Kathy Acker for me isn't melodrama, it's flatness. Reading a text by Kathy Acker produces ambivalence, not suffering. If Acker was affiliated with New Narrative, it's fair to say that to some degree she resisted that vital utopic thread that tugged the work into a thin melodic fantasy hovering above and sometimes running below. Rather, by bricolaging appropriated texts and blunt personal polemic, sexual scenario, and blind rhetoric, Acker levels each text so they become indistinguishable in their proximity to each other. Like Joey, everything she touches turns to garbage. She's interested only in stripping every word and turning it into waste. Kathy Acker is not interested in doom, and less than doom, Kathy Acker is not interested in living. Kathy Acker doesn't give a fuck because Kathy Acker is the dead zone. Kathy Acker has always already been dead. Thank you.
Here we are. My essay is called Those Fabulous Narcissists, and my essay might be about a lot of things, but the title is taken from an epigraph by Sarah Schulman in her conversation with Buuck, and I want to read that epigraph before reading my short paragraph. It's so ironic to be a survivor, isn't it, Bob? Those fabulous narcissists would be enraged to discover that they are dependent on us, their inferiors, to be remembered. I am manic about saying the names of the dead everywhere I go. Often I'm asked, what makes you so interested in literature from this period, and AIDS literature in particular? Didn't you hear, young people don't care about AIDS? I take these people into my story. I say, but we know that AIDS is still with us, and the way we fuck and want to be seen, and statistics of HIV infection rates, the tales we tell one another about our liberation, what we want to believe about young people. Are you listening? All my life I've been asked to remember somebody I've never known. And I'm trying to think through that call to remember, to memorialize and discover who is asking that of me, and how it contours and animates my knowledge about sexuality, self, politics. I've found that sometimes this call to remember does come from queers, but sometimes, to my surprise, it's coming from the state or the law. The PSA on the subway asks me to remember HIV and AIDS, but only in certain ways, to keep me afraid and shy of my own rage, to be more responsible in and for my own life. This is precisely not the surprise, the neoliberal discourse of self-responsibility. At that point, things get a bit heady. So I decide to work in something personal. I say, I'll tell you something. When I was very young, I thought I would die by being smashed by a boulder. Then I thought I would die from AIDS because that's how gay people died on TV. Now the question of my death is which revolution is going to come first. But when I turn away from HIV and AIDS, there is a structure even to that turn, even in that relief. You know, I was out near Ukiah once, outside on a weathered leather couch, knotted up in a boy in front of a group of men. It was a fairy gathering, but this wasn't so long ago. I was wearing tight turquoise jeans, and this boy was falling out of his pair of tight cherry-colored cutoffs. Being in love in front of these men, even briefly, relief structured our night together. It tugged their breath at the sight of us. In our raw sex in the sanctuary of our tent out back, to know that they could hear us, two 20-something grad students obsessed with their lives, fucking, to know it was raw, that there were already words out there for what we were doing with our own bodies. Maybe this story is completely wrecked by nostalgia, and maybe you can read that in me. I get so nervous about nostalgia. Do you know what I mean? I'll put my hand on his shoulder, his chest, his thigh. I'll say, our nostalgia always seems to yearn for a time before AIDS, or for a time when sexuality seemed to command, seemingly without effort, a vibrant antagonism to the status quo. These are the nostalgic stories we pass back and forth like snowballs of our golden years. But, like, who can afford to be nostalgic for the 20th century anyway? Then I pick up my good looks and put them to use. I go in for the kill.
Listening to everyone read, I realized that I had forgotten one profound gesture of gratitude, and that's to everyone's amazing contributions to this volume. So, yeah, thank you, and I also thank you for your patience with us and this long haul project. So, anyway, let's give it up to everyone.
So again, we're going to read this question, panelists can respond, and then we invite all of you to also have this conversation. New narrative might be said to have an ambivalent relationship to the academy. A few of its early practitioners taught at universities, though as contingent labor, and most eschewed the academic conference scene and other scholarly venues for critical discourse. Up until very recently, the academic world has largely ignored new narrative. At the same time, many new narrative texts are small press publications, or currently out of print, or never even formally published, and thus a lot of new narrative might be considered a fugitive literature. Given this, what is at stake in the presumption that whatever it is we might call new narrative wants or needs scholarly attention to ensure its future unfolding, especially considering how its reception is now more and more mediated by the Academy, including this conference? Does From Our Hearts to Yours address this, and if so, how?
And you're supposed to
Who's got tenure?
Someone wanna? I'll say something since I wrote an essay on teaching.
You have to like
really loud.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. So yeah, I guess I'm of two minds, and there should probably be more than two minds. On the one hand, I absolutely believe that placing new narrative within academic settings is important for ensuring its survival, and that like resources are thrown at it, and that it becomes available to work on archivally. Otherwise, that's just like so important for something you want to preserve within culture, obviously. And I don't know if that just has to happen within the academy. I think on the other hand, I like Stefano Harney and Fred Moten's notion of being in but not of the academy, and I think that's also useful to think about how new narrative injects academic discourse and infiltrates it with something otherwise, something that is messing with it and is antagonistic to it. So yeah, like how might we use new narrative materials to kind of like squat in, you know, as maroons or fugitives within the academy, especially in as much as many of us are without tenure and won't have tenure because of the neoliberalization of the university, and also because of the nature of the material that interests us, which does have like a revolutionary content, I think.
Well, I guess I'm one of the rare or only people who actually does have tenure, but it's not all unicorns and rainbows across the board, I can tell you that, because not all institutions have equal resources, obviously. I work at a very underfunded public institution in the South where 51% of the students are first-generation college students, and almost that many are students of color, and that's not an institution that the state really gives a shit about funding. But I think this was one of the questions that I had raised in regard to the panel, because I think in terms of baldly practical sorts of things, such as keeping books in print, that having people teach them is obviously one of the ways that you can put resources towards small presses to get things back in print or to keep things in print. And I think it makes a difference in terms of, you know, working with young writers, a way that they can conceive of themselves and know of themselves as part of a narrative or history that they didn't even know existed. Because I'll end up on MFA committees. I'm not formally an MFA faculty member for a variety of reasons, which have been very contentious over my time at this place. But to end up on these committees where students come to me and to give them a book by Dodie Bellamy or give them a book by Eileen Myles that they would not have known existed, and to see the ways in which their lives are transformed. That's not just an academic moment, that's a personal transformation moment, and I think that's extremely powerful.
I think there's a political context for this question, which is the declining support for independent venues, magazines, reading series. I want to just make the point that Bob's workshop was actually funded by the state of California. And I think that we were able, I think that New Narrative exists in part because we were before the neoliberal max moment. Yeah. And that this political moment threatens the cultural survival of all kinds of independent arts. And it's just something, I mean, we all live in communities with small arts institutions, and one of the ways we fight this is by supporting those institutions that aren't in the academy. And I think it's true that everybody seeks shelter in the university because it's a forest fire out there, but we have to keep the bigger perspective too, you know.
Yeah, I guess I wanted to raise the point that I think that, you know, the university might need new narrative, but I don't think that new narrative needs the university. Because you know, I talked about this in the panel that I was on yesterday, and you know, in 2008, before she became famous, I went to college with Lena Dunham. I'm sorry, I'm an Oberlin grad. But, you know, but she was a friend of mine back then, and she said that Mina Harker was her favorite book. And she wasn't lying, like, she's well-read. And then over the years, you know, I would be in the rooms of lovers and friends who didn't have college degrees, and they would have Jack the Modernist and Marjorie Kemp on their shelves. Like this, it doesn't have anything to do with the academy in the first place in a lot of ways. Like this is about, like, I think that in that way the fugitivity of the writing is embodied in that sense, because so many people who are outside of the academy already know about it, but they just aren't invited to the academy. And so I think that that's like something that needs to be said, at least.
Before we move on to the next question, we can open it up if anyone wants to jump in, throw a comment or a follow-up question.
Something about that. So I'm not a writer, I'm an artist, and one of the discussions among artists is that there's been such a professionalization of art. And I think listening to you speak, it sounds really exciting, but I think as artists we're really fighting the fact that there are less and less non-university graduates with books on their shelves, not because there aren't people reading, but because there's so much pressure for young people to attend universities. Is that something that's happening in writing, or is that to the same, I mean, I guess that this is something that's really being resisted among artists and fighting, but it's not really working.
Maybe that's more of a comment. Yeah, Nathan.
And maybe I could say something to that, which is that my experience in these contexts is that actually the sorts of organizations that Camille was speaking about were organizations that not only house writers, but house visual artists, house performance artists, house particular types of music making or sound art. And it's those independent arts organizations that actually provided a kind of place of cross-pollinization aside from an academic environment. And so that, I think, is one of the things that's a crucial part of the discussion for everybody.
So in the interest of time, we just move to the next question, and just to remind folks that so the questions, we sourced the questions from the panelists themselves, and then Robin and I did some synthesizing, and so we're feeding back what we were fed. So the next question addresses queerness. How does our book attend to the mobilization of sex and sexuality in new narrative texts? Does the adoption of new narrative practices and strategies by straight writers, for example, the so-called dandies that Eric Sneathen's essay refers to and thinks critically about, how does this phenomenon signal an end to the queerness of the new narrative project? Was new narrative really queer to begin with? Given the essays in our book, how important is sex to what new narrative was or might be?
I didn't write that question. I'm off the hook for the moment.
You might be the one to answer it.
Interesting. My question wasn't that one at all. The question is. You need loud. Eric, louder. I need to talk louder.
Yeah.
All I'm doing is repeating the question. How does the book attend to the mobilization of sex and sexuality in new narrative texts? And maybe like the one that I find super fascinating, was new narrative really queer to begin with? I don't understand that question. I'm surprised that somebody has that. Maybe not queer in the sense of like being talked about by queer theorists, maybe not in that canon. Like it's not like we have an essay from Sedgwick or Butler on new narrative, but that doesn't make it not queer, of course. And I mean, that's the kind of fugitivity that Rees is talking about in his essay, and the way that the books move as well. So, who's queer, what is queer, right? Like just going back to those questions for sure.
I mean, I think maybe it also is a larger question about the relationship between identity and experimental art making. And that's a really difficult question. Identity sometimes feels like a mythology that art also participates in collectively creating, right? So what did it mean in that moment? Like how did sexuality or experiences of sexuality shape the way that these aesthetic practices functioned outside of just being in a community? Or maybe that was what it was. You know what I mean? Like I heard Mike Petras speak a couple weeks ago about how, making a film is just throwing a party with all your friends. Right? And so those two things are related that way. Like I don't think it has to be as concretely enmeshed as people think it is, right? Lots of things contribute to myths of art and
Right, again, in the interest of time, I'm maybe move on. So this question is there something historically specific about new narrative's formal strategies? How does the book contribute to our understanding of this? To what extent has new narrative writing today become a style, like some other avant-garde literary movements? If we read new narrative today divorced from the specific social and political concerns out of which it arose, does this risk reducing new narrative to a set of surface effects, influences, modes, like first-personism, pop culture, gossip about the scene, etc.? As for some of those concerns, we might think of a critique of middle-class gay sociality and its representations from gay lib through the AIDS crisis. I will say we thought we were shortening these questions. If you'd like to read it.
Some of that comes from one of my questions or a provocation, and this is, in some ways, I mean, these are questions we ask of a lot of avant-garde movements as they move through time and become either canonized or become just narrativized among practitioners. and this is an age-old story in all the arts, which is when formal avant-gardes become styles to be picked up, especially in the modes of professionalization, which I think is less overt in new narrative. But I'm deeply invested in the story I tell to myself about new narrative is so much about the social and cultural politics of the writing scenes in the 70s. I'm more well versed with the Bay Area moment, but and the fusion of content with that form, right? They seem inseparable to me, and yet, as with other avant-gardes, that there are formal strategies in which you can pour in new contents, right? And to what degree, and this is me just being a grumpy old man, but like, does it become a way to discuss whatever, I'll choose myself, like my hand-wringing, white hat, straight, cis problems with the aura of experimentation when I could just write another whatever, N+1 auto-fiction about whatever, bourgeois life in America. So, I haven't eaten this morning. But, anyways, I think you get the point of the question, which is without being dismissive of the way in which subsequent generations have taken up these traditions. And I think one of the things, to be more generous, that I find very fascinating, I think it's coming up so far in this conference, is the way in which the generosity of the way people tell these stories about not just community as a empty category, but the stakes of those communities. And I think that that feels really powerful because, and this is part of why, maybe the benefits of it not having been taken up at the Academy, it doesn't get reduced to a set of formal strategy, right? We talk precisely about the social and the difficult and fraught swamps out of which these formal strategies arise, and I think that that's really powerful to think about in our own historical moment. Rather than replicating those forms, what were the questions that were asked by those writers of their time vis-a-vis form and their social problems, and how might we apply those to the present?
As a follow-up to that, and maybe a way to conclude the conversation, it might be interesting to ask, and this is the final bit of the final question that we prepared. Is new narrative now a historical artifact, or are its practices and forms alive and relevant? This, of course, was one of the presuppositions that motivated our editing project and yielded the book. And so is new narrative now a historical artifact, or are its practices and forms alive and relevant? Does our book make good on its argument for new narrative as a contemporary practice? And it might be a nice moment to invite younger contributors and folks in the audience to throw in your sense of that.
I think that, you read sentences from any number of new narrative writers and they'd hit you like a ton of bricks. I texted Sid in the middle of Bob's reading last night because he said, loneliness is the excess of self, which is hell. And you're like, what the fuck? That's the smartest thing I've heard about loneliness and personhood in over a year. And it's one sentence, It's fucking incredible, right? And so, anybody who reads it is blown away by it. And I think that's true for, I don't want to speak for everybody, but I think that's true for a lot of us, younger people. Yeah.
You guys can speak on behalf of the youth. I can't speak on behalf of the youth. I will say that what people are sort of gesturing towards that I think is really important also is the fact that, certain kinds of art making can only come out of certain cultural and political and historical contexts. I think that it's a little bit like this was raised in Carl Goldberg's recent book, but like if you wear a Silence Equals Death shirt now, it doesn't mean that you understand that moment. Even if you've studied that history, you can respect the way that people resisted and learn from it, but it doesn't mean that you have that understanding. And so the work that you make now is, it just can't be inflected the way that, you know, people were making it work or ACT UP or whatever. But I do think that, you know, the ways in which, like we were saying, the ways in which people engage with their moment is something that's really crucial in your narrative, and that's something that everyone who has read it is really interested in reformulating for themselves, right?
I think we're done.